Welcome everybody. This is the Secure a Vote, voting in the time of COVID town hall. We're thrilled to have you on. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes, but you're welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat. I see Donna from Phoenix, Jocelyn from Chicago, Joe from Kenosha, my home state, Wisconsin, Jane from Richmond, Virginia, Peggy from Atlanta, Rich from Florida, welcome. Wonderful to see everybody joining. If you're just joining now, you can introduce yourselves in the chat if you're on the Zoom. If you are on the live stream, you can ask questions and introduce yourselves in the comments under the live stream. All right, we are going to get started. Welcome. This is the Secure Our Vote, voting in the time of COVID town hall. We're glad to have you with us. My name is Akane Freechild, and I'm with Public Citizen and the Secure Our Vote Coalition. I will be moderating today's call. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you have questions, you can post them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen on Zoom or in the comment section on Facebook Live. This event is co-sponsored by the Secure Our Vote Coalition, Public Citizen, Verified Voting, the National Vote at Home Institute, Declaration for American Democracy Coalition, Daily Costs, People for the American Way, Common Cause, and Secure Elections Network. So today we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID on our elections. We're going to be hearing from me about those challenges, and then from Audrey Kline from Vote at Home on mail-in voting, voting at home options. We're going to be hearing from Marion Schneider at Verified Voting about the security issues that we should be paying attention to in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. And then we're going to hear what we can do about the problems that we're concerned about in our states and at the national level, at the local level from Diallo Brooke. We hope to have a lot of time for questions. We will have a little bit of time for questions in between the speakers. We're also going to be doing some polling to hear what you all are thinking about and what you think we should be doing. So I'm going to just get started and tell you a little bit about the problems and where we came from. So Public Citizen is a public interest organization. It has 500,000 members and supporters. We defend democracy, resist corporate power, and strive to ensure that government works for everyday people. We co-founded the Secure Our Vote Coalition with Common Cause, People for the American Way, Rock the Vote, Stand Up America, and a number of other wonderful partners you can find on our website, because our elections are already underfunded, understaffed, and in too many places, unable to recover easily from hacks, computer error, and disasters like COVID-19. Last year, we won congressional funding for election security with many of the groups on this call. Now we must rise to a new challenge. Much of the work to stop hacks and errors has been overshadowed by the ongoing COVID epidemic. This is a photo of people trying to vote in the Wisconsin primary elections earlier this month. And this is down the street from where I grew up. You can't see the high school where voting is taking place because the line stretched way into the neighboring park and the following blocks. Whenever you see a line like this, you know that there are people missing. People with disabilities, people with young children, people who have to go to work and can't wait in a line like this. So basically, you see people who are trying to vote, but you don't see the people who lost their right to vote on the 7th. Because of COVID-19, Wisconsin election officials scrambled desperately to find enough workers to process absentee requests, send out ballots, and to staff early voting and polling locations. The wait for curbside voting was over 2 hours in Milwaukee on some days. Statewide, over 10,000 absentee ballot requests did not get fulfilled on time. Milwaukee cut 180 polling locations down to 5 for Election Day because of lack of staff, despite help from the National Guard. Green Bay had only 2 polling locations instead of 31. Election results were delayed a week. Many ballots were thrown out, likely because they arrived too late. As of yesterday, according to ABC News, at least 52 people who voted and worked on the Wisconsin primary have COVID-19, likely many more because testing is not available for all. Wisconsin was the first worst case scenario election of what could be many if we don't act now to get funding to every local and state election official and best practices in place today. Wisconsin needed more time. They also needed more staff to run expanded vote by mail and early voting programs for mail opening and sorting machines, thousands more poll workers and drop boxes for ballots, things that cost money. The Brennan Center for Justice put out a report today that outlines the real needs of 5 states to adapt their elections to COVID, just as an example of what needs to happen. It's a good reference for what your state might need. Congress allocated $400 million recently to help election officials, but the cost to adapt our 2020 elections is more like $4 billion. The small amount of funding that is available from the federal government requires states to provide some matching funds, which some cannot provide. The risk of not getting funds to the states is serious. It means that some people will not be able to vote, especially older people or anyone who's not able to get or use a mail-in ballot who doesn't feel safe voting in person. There's a risk that people will get confused because it's not clear how they're supposed to vote. They may get discouraged and they may not vote for that reason. We're concerned that some states and localities will expand or try internet voting, which is impossible to secure. And finally, if there is chaos on election day, it could be exploited by foreign adversaries who are attacking our democracy or other people who want to spread disinformation. So needless to say, we desperately need significant federal funding now to make our democracy strong and make sure that our elections are protected and everyone's able to exercise their right. So we're asking you to call for $4 billion for local and state elections in the next COVID stimulus package that Congress is considering. Please call your US senators first thing tomorrow and let them know we need these funds and we need them now. If you've already called, please call them again. And tonight, if you can write a letter to the editor, it's usually just 5 sentences long, is perfect. We've linked you to the Declaration for American Democracy letter to the editor tool on this subject, and we'd love to have your help with that too, to get the word out. So now we're going to launch our first poll. For folks who are on the live stream, I'm going to read this out loud for you. Folks on the Zoom, you are free to vote as I read it. Which challenges do you think are most important to address for fair elections in 2020? And this is choose as many as you like. Lack of funding to states to make elections safer for voters and election workers. Challenge of securing our voting systems, and you can vote while I'm talking, folks on Zoom. Lack of option for every voter to vote by mail. People getting discouraged and not voting because it's confusing how they're supposed to vote. The challenge of expanding early vote accessibility. A lack of cookies at polling locations, and combating disinformation. So folks are voting very rapidly. I'm going to give them a couple seconds more to weigh in, and then I'll let you know what the results are. And I'm going to end that poll. So overwhelmingly, 85% of folks who voted said the lack of funding to states to make elections safer for voters and election workers is their biggest concern, followed by the lack of option for every voter to vote by mail, followed by the challenge of securing voting systems and combating disinformation, followed by people getting discouraged and not voting, and finally, and the challenge of expanding early vote and accessibility that actually ranked a little bit higher than discouragement. Only 7% felt that the lack of cookies was the most important issue. Okay, so we have one more poll for you, and then we're going to introduce the next speaker. This poll is about vote by mail. We'd like to know from you, have you voted by mail or do you plan to vote by mail? If that's an option for you in your state, you can go ahead and vote. The 4 options for folks who can't see the poll are yes, I currently do vote by mail. No, I've never voted by mail is option number 2. 3, I have in the past voted by mail. Or 4, no, but I plan to this year. Folks have a couple more seconds to vote on this poll. Okay, I'm going to end polling. Thanks for everyone who weighed in. So about just under 40% of call attendees on the Zoom do currently vote by mail, which is higher than the average in the US, but still really cool that you have that option, or you newly have that option. 26% of folks do plan to vote this year, although they haven't voted by mail in the past. And 18% never have or only have in the past. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Audrey Kline is the National Policy Director at National Vote at Home Institute. Take it away, Audrey.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me. My name is Audrey Kline. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm thrilled to be here. I first of all just want to start off with introducing the organization Vote at Home, the National Vote at Home Institute. We're an independent, nonpartisan organization, and we work to get ballots in the hands of people at their homes. We advocate for a system much like that in Colorado. And we do it through a couple different ways. We work directly with elections officials. We work with advocacy groups, and also we do policy work. Next slide, please. First of all, I think it's really important to talk about what is vote by mail exactly. It's sometimes called absentee voting, and every state already does it. It's important to keep that in mind, that military and overseas voters already have access to this. What's different about it is that not every state does it the same. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Some states mail every eligible voter a ballot. That's what Colorado, Utah, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii do this year. Next slide is what is vote by mail not? This is important because it's not universal. Not every state gives the opportunity to vote without an excuse. We think that's very important to keep in mind. It's also not a panacea. So just being able to get a ballot is not going to work for everyone. It's not more costly necessarily than other voting modes. It's not new. We've been doing this since the 1800s, and it's also not ripe for fraud. We hear that a lot lately, and I think there's going to be a lot of talk tonight on this call about how it can be a very secure system, and I really look forward to getting into some of the details with our friends. Next slide, please. This is what the world used to look like before the COVID-19 crisis sort of crept up on us. As you can see, the United States is really just a patchwork of states and policies, and things used to sort of fit into these very nice categories for us. Next slide, please. This is our attempt to capture the massive amount of changes that are happening every day in our election system across the country. There are places like Texas and Indiana that are dealing with court fights over who's allowed to vote by mail and who's not. There's places like Nevada that said, we're going to go all vote by mail for this primary. And then you have places like Alabama that has made literally no changes so far. And we think that's important. We're trying to capture that. And what's important from my organization is that we're trying to gather all these changes, and we're trying to move them towards a voter-centric model. We want every voter to have as many options to exercise their right to vote as possible. Next slide, please. Now, I work for an organization called Vote at Home. And we advocate for a vote at home model, which is slightly different than just voting by mail. We're talking about a comprehensive system that is more than just offering mail ballots. We think that the in-person voter options are very important for a lot of reasons, including equity, those with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, things like that. And then it also encompasses a whole suite of best practices and policies that we recommend that make the system more secure, more accessible, and improves the voter experience. Next slide. This is a big slide, so just know that there's just a lot of these policies are the parts and pieces of a really good system that we recommend. Just handing someone a ballot or mailing it to their house is just not enough for everyone. So these other bits and pieces are very, very important. So adding accessibility measures for people that are differently abled, blind, homebound, need help or translation, all of those things are pieces of the puzzle that we try to put together rather than just mailing a ballot. Next slide. We also really, really value election security. It's top issue. A good system is highly secure and highly accessible. So it's using things like signature verification, paper ballots that are traceable, also adding in the ability for those in-person services that you really, really need to make sure that people can have confidence in the system. And we like to point out that the system is secure. Over 250 million mail ballots have been cast in the past 20 years, and there's been just an absolute minuscule amount of mischief involved. We like to point out that it's not perfect, but these folks have gotten caught trying to get around the system. So it's very, very secure. And sadly, you're more likely to show up to a polling place and have someone misread your name, or have a place that's like missing power cords or something like that, than you are to actually experience some sort of actual mail voter fraud. Next slide, please. We also think it's important to point out that to be an equitable system, vote by mail is a key piece. Lots of states are showing really big increases across the board with youth voting when they mail ballots to folks, so they make it more accessible to do so. We're seeing research that shows massive growth all the way across demographic and racial and socioeconomic lines. We think all of those pieces are very, very important, and we advocate for those policies across the board. And the last slide here is really sort of a quick breakdown of what can you do. You are several hundred people across the country, and you're all interested in democracy and reform. And the single most important thing I can tell you to do right now is, wherever you are, is to make sure that you can get a mail ballot at home if that is a good way for you to vote. So that could be applying for a mail ballot, could be applying for an absentee ballot. Sometimes they're a little different in some states. And then help your friends and family do the same thing. We have some good friends and collaborators at wecanvote.us and voteamerica.com. They do really good work in aggregating how to make these things work in your state, because every state's different. They have lots of information around voter registration. Sometimes they can point you directly to your local official that can sign you up for a mail ballot. You should do it. Everyone should do it if it's the right choice for you. And then the other thing that you can do is work with your local clerks, your networks, and your elected officials to push policies like the ones that we recommend at Vote at Home to make sure that your local elections are safer, more secure, more accessible, and more equitable. And with that, I think my time's expired. So thank you so much for having me. We'd love to answer your questions and be a really good partner to you and your networks.
Great. Thank you so much, Audrey. We have a couple questions. We'll see if we can do at least one before we move forward in the agenda, and then we'll have more time for questions at the end. Folks, just remember, if you're on the Zoom, you can use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen when you float your mouse at the bottom to ask questions. If you're on the live stream, you can put it in the comments, and we will do our best to do as many questions as we can. So the first question we have is from Charlene in Berkeley. In Georgia, if a voter hasn't voted in recent elections, that is the excuse for removing his or her name from the rolls, and then vote by mail ballots are discarded over variations of signatures. What kind of oversight can be put in place to ensure that all votes are counted?
Sure. So first of all, the way that signatures are verified in Georgia is changing a little bit. There's been some lawsuits around how that's done. In particular, we think that a statewide process that is, the same across counties, and then is also demographically blind. We were finding in some counties, when someone was looking to verify a signature, they could see other information that had to do with that voter. So that could be their party affiliation. Sometimes it was other demographic data, and it would skew how that system worked. So those are changing. We hope to sort of see some really good changes for that this year. So that's part of the big puzzle there. And then also, inactive voters is really sort of what has become a partisan fight across the country. I know some places mail ballots to all eligible voters, and I think even in Georgia this year, they're only mailing applications out to active voters. So I think you're right there that people are going to miss out on an opportunity. But that's where a lot of nonprofits, activists like the folks on this call, they have a real opportunity to make a difference in their community by stepping in and helping organize their neighbors, making sure that their friends and family have the ability to get a mail ballot by signing up for an absentee.
Great. Thanks so much, Audrey. And we'll have time for more questions for Audrey later in the program.
Thank you.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce Marion Schneider. She's the president of Verified Voting. Before she became the president of Verified Voting, she served as Deputy Secretary for Elections and Administration in the Pennsylvania Department of State from 2015 to May of 2017 and oversaw elections during the 2016 presidential elections. Marion.
Thank you, Kline. And you can put the first slide up. Welcome to all the participants. These are extraordinary times that we are living in that will surely test our republic, and we'll get through this together. As Audrey mentioned, many jurisdictions will be expanding mail-in voting options for voters this year. But our elections face a dual threat. We are in the middle of a public health crisis, and we are coming off the 2016 election in which a nation state attacked our election and attempted to interfere with it. One of the ways they did that was through hacking. That threat hasn't disappeared. I am well aware of the threat to our elections through cyber interference. I was at the Pennsylvania Department of State in 2016. We took common sense measures then to protect our elections, and those are still important. And the single most important thing jurisdictions can do is make their systems resilient. That is, have the ability to detect an attack and recover from it. At Verified Voting, we're one of the leading organizations focused exclusively on election security. Our mission is to strengthen democracy for all voters by promoting the responsible use of technology in elections. We work to bridge the gap between computer science, cybersecurity, and election administration. And at Verified Voting, we like to talk a lot about democracy as a three-legged stool. Next slide. The first leg of the stool is voter registration, that all eligible voters who wish to can register to vote. The second leg of the stool is voter participation in GOTV, that all registered voters who wish to vote can do so without burdens and barriers. And the third leg is what we do, election security, and that's making sure that technology, which is pervasive in our elections, is not unsafe and is not misused to disenfranchise voters. If any one leg of the stool fails, our democracy fails. That's why as states pivot to ramp up mail-in ballots, election security must continue to be part of the planning process. Technology still touches the voting process at multiple points, and computers still count the ballots. In these uncertain times, it's more important than ever that all the safeguards and best practices surrounding security are followed so that we have a trustworthy record and can all have confidence in the outcome. Verified Voting has issued a short overview of the security considerations for mail-in voting. So next slide. I'm going to highlight a few of them, and you can check out the full recommendations on our website and especially check out the links to other resources that's in there. But first, it's important for states to adopt and publicize ballot tracking systems that allow voters to locate their ballot envelopes en route from and to election offices while maintaining anonymity of their ballot selections. Even letting voters know via email that their application for a ballot has been received, that it's been approved, and that it's on the way to them really helps to bolster confidence. If your jurisdiction asks you for an email address and phone number, give it to them. That allows them to contact you about the status of your ballot and if there's a problem. Second, authenticating and making sure the ballots are genuine needs to be part of the process, but not burdensome. In some states that have burdensome rules, substituting a more streamlined process that includes signature checking, even on an emergency basis, is preferable. And providing voters notice of problems and opportunity to correct those problems is also important. Third, paper ballots require effective physical security and procedures that document the location of all ballots, restrict and monitor access to them, so that everyone can have confidence that their votes are safely stored and handled properly before, during, and after counting. Fourth, computers that count ballots are a target for hacking and outside interference, and they can be subject to plain old errors. Verified voting staff and board members are experts in post-election tabulation audits. An audit is a scientifically sound random sample of the paper ballots to check that the computers counted the votes properly. We are working with jurisdictions to conduct rigorous audits, and we love to do more. Most jurisdictions are talking about offering safe voting methods and primarily ramping up mail-in ballots. And that's a good thing. First, because every state already has some process for handling mail-in ballots. And second, because most states are not talking about ramping up online voting, although some are doing so. Allowing a large number of voters to send their ballots over the internet is simply not secure and increases the risks of attacks, tampering, spoofs, and even shutting down the entire system. These risks are increased to unacceptable levels. It would also feed into the narrative that the results cannot be trusted. Last week, the Washington Post's editorial board published an opinion piece warning against internet voting, and I urge you to read it. We do need to ensure that voters with disabilities have a secure, accessible, and verifiable method for voting. Remote accessible vote by mail systems that allow voters with disabilities to use their own assistive devices on their own computers to mark a ballot, print it, and deliver it back to the jurisdiction is one such alternative, provided that the voted ballot is not sent back over the internet and the program prevents private information from being stored or sent over the internet. It's also important to remember that we need a multi-layered approach to voting now that includes in-person voting options, also for voters with disabilities, to provide language access, and for those voters who didn't receive or are unable to receive a mail-in ballot. These options must follow CDC guidelines for social distancing, and poll workers will need protective equipment. Elections are essential operations, poll workers are essential workers, and prioritizing the supplies for elections should be front and center for policymakers. We also need to adjust our expectations. We all need to understand the process in our own state for canvassing and counting ballots. The reported results on election night are unofficial. Most states have at least 2 weeks, and some have more time to get official results. Find out the process in your state and encourage your local voter services office to publicize the process. Allowing this process to proceed in an orderly way doesn't mean there's anything wrong or that there are shenanigans. Election officials need our support to take the time to properly count ballots and get an accurate count. Accuracy is the value, not speed. And so now finally on the last slide, what can you do? First of all, check your voter registration status. We have a program, #CheckYourReg. If you've moved in state, make sure you update your address. If you've moved out of state, register in your new location and don't wait till the last minute. Also, keep an eye out for election mail. It's not junk mail. We recommend that jurisdictions send a postcard to all registered voters to clean up their list and capture signatures that are missing or need updating. So keep an eye out for that kind of mail. Also, volunteer if you can in your local jurisdiction in any way that would be helpful and you feel safe doing so. But these measures that we've been talking about tonight, both pivoting to alternate voting methods and ensuring good security, will take resources. Contact your elected representatives, especially your US Senator, and urge them to support measures that provide funding, especially funding that will get into the hands of local officials. The largest need will be additional staffing and also the support for mail-in balloting. Finally, if you need help or information, the Election Protection Coalition that the hosts of this event belong to has a hotline you can call, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, and you can also contact your state and local governments. And with that, I believe we have a poll.
We do.
Where is the poll? Do you want to read it? Go ahead, Penny. You do so well.
Okay. Which of the following do the experts at Verify Voting consider an election security best practice? Check all that apply, focus on Zoom, voter verified paper ballots, 2, sending voted ballots electronically over the internet or mobile apps, 3, post-election audits, 4, strong chain of custody of the ballots. So folks who are on live stream, we're going to give folks on Zoom a little bit more time to vote here, and then we will let you know what they decided. A few more seconds. Okay. Closing polling now. Voter verified paper ballots takes the cake with 50%.
Wait,
Is that right, Marion?
I think they must have misunderstood the question. We were asking which is not, right? Oh, that they've got it right too. It's
No, they got it right.
4%, they got it right. 1% picked that, so good job.
So 50% said voter verified paper ballots are a good security practice.
Yeah.
40% said strong chain of custody of the ballots. And then 9% said post-election audits, and 1%, 4 people, said that I bet they misread the question, that sending voted ballots electronically over the internet or mobile app is a best practice for security. Do you want to comment on that and we'll take questions?
Well, people have been asking about why we can't vote online because we can bank online. And there's 2 really critical differences between the voting transaction and our banking transaction. And the first is the need for authentication. We need to identify the voters and make sure the voter is who they say they are. And so that's the first thing. And those problems have not been solved. And the second thing is once we identify the voter, we strip the identity from the voted ballot because it's supposed to be anonymous. And that's a very difficult security problem. And the cybersecurity experts that I know and the consensus in cybersecurity and computer science is that that problem has not been solved. When a banking transaction is not anonymous, you know what the transaction is, you have a record of it, and you can check against those records. You can't do that with voting. I always use this example. When if my son takes my credit card and buys a game on Steam, I get a bill later that shows that he bought that game on Steam, and I can decline it. You can't do that with voting, and that's what the difference is. And the other thing is, banks and online retailers spend hundreds of millions of dollars to protect their networks, and they still get hacked, and they still have lots of losses, financial losses that they cover, and we never really even hear about that. But you can't do that with an election.
Before we move on to Diallo, post-election audits did not get ranked as high by our voters. I think both you and I think they're pretty important. Do you want to comment on that briefly?
That's post-election audits, which require a trustworthy record, strong chain of custody, and ballot accounting procedures. They require a paper ballot that's verified by the voter. So what a post-election audit does is it checks that the computers counted those paper ballots correctly. And that's why they're an important security measure. Yes, you test your equipment. Yes, you take extensive steps to mitigate all the risks that there could be errors or attacks, but you can never get that risk down to 0. And that's what the audit does. It allows you to check and make sure that there aren't any problems with the computers after the fact. And they can be used for always for in-person voting, but also mail-in ballots can support that, and as if they are implemented, as both Audrey and I have been talking about this evening.
Yeah, a lot of us who care about election security do see one positive of having more mail-in balloting is more voters have the option to mark a paper ballot by hand, which they may not have had before.
Right.
So there's a silver lining possibly. All right, thank you so much, Marion. We're going to hear more from Marion in the Q&A at the end of this next presentation from Diallo Brooke. He's the Senior Director of Outreach and Public Engagement at People for the American Way. And he's going to talk to us about what we can do, I believe, although, Diallo, there you are. Take it away.
I'm here. How's everybody doing tonight? First of all, I just wanted to thank you all for hosting this. Thank everyone that's online that jumped on in the middle of the night to participate in this because you all feel it's important. We all know it's important, and we know that protecting our right to vote, even during this difficult time that we're in, is critically important. And as was mentioned at the top of this this webinar, this teletown hall, or this video town hall, we saw what happened in Wisconsin. we saw that there were lines, long lines of folks weren't able to social distance, and all of those good things that happened during that election. We have time now to evaluate that and make changes that are necessary to really make sure that we have a safe and secure opportunity to participate in voting. Democracy is a fundamental principle of this country. It doesn't function if the voice of the people is not heard. And so we have to do everything possible to make sure that our elected officials in Congress, our elected officials on the state and local level are aware that we want safe and secure elections. And you all have heard some fantastic information about how these systems work, what's important, what we need to do. And I think the most important thing now is for us to really mobilize to make our voices heard amongst all the noise that's out there right now of how critical this is to protecting our democracy. And so we want folks to do everything possible to make sure that you're, one, calling your senators, letting them know that you want that $4 billion for elections in the next stimulus package. Let me repeat that. We want folks to call their senators and ask them to include that $4 billion for elections in the next stimulus package. It is incredibly important. And if you see on your screen, we have a dial-in number, 1-888-415-4527, which will give you the instructions of how to connect to your senator to make that ask. But I will say one other thing. When you're calling, you also need to tell your friends and your neighbors and your family members to also do the same thing, because we need a lot of voices drowning, penetrating those offices to let them know how critically important this is to the people, that we really care. We want these elections to function the right way, and we need to do everything possible to make sure that they're safe, secure, and we have all the options so all communities are able to participate. And you heard about all of those other options to participate, and we need to make those real and happen, and need those dollars to hit the states to make sure that those systems are up and ready for us to vote. Also, there's another tool, and we can go to the next slide. There's another tool that we have on the website, which is a great tool, is to be able to write a letter to the editor for your local paper. And let me say this. Writing letters to the editor also help educate people that you don't even know. So it lets those newspapers know that, oh, okay, these things are really important to the folks that live in our community. And as those letters are in those papers, or in those publications, other folks that are going to be able to read it and say, hey, this is critically important to me, and I need to call my senator, I need to call my local elected officials to make sure that we have safe, secure elections, and that as we're fighting for dollars for the stimulus, that we need to make sure that there's dollars in there to make sure that we have the systems in place to have a democracy that functions for all of us. Our voices must be heard at every election, and we must have the tools to make it safe, to make it secure, to make sure that everybody, no matter who you are and what you look like, you're able to participate. And so we want folks to take this tool. It helps you out. It's right on the website. It's Declaration for AmericanDemocracy.org/LTE. So if folks go on that, just click on the link, go right onto the site. It'll help you write that letter to the editor. And it's really a critically important thing for folks to do. We can go to the next slide. The other thing is, if you've already called your senator, you've already written that letter, consider reaching out to your local elected officials. Because local elected officials, the state and local elected officials have the power to really push for the change that's necessary to make sure that these elections happen the right way. In Wisconsin, there were local elected officials and state elected officials that were able to really push to make sure that they had systems in place to be able to fight for the right to vote. Now, the federal government, the Supreme Court made probably the wrong decision in that situation, but still having their voices echo, and their voices and also the lessons that they've learned throughout the process of running elections is very helpful. And so encouraging them to make sure that they're reaching out to their senators, and then those that have good relationships with those elected officials is really organizing with them to elevate voices, to tell stories that help to make sure that people understand the real urgency behind this. This fight is about us. Only we can make this happen. If we sit on the sidelines and we don't participate and we don't push, we won't see that funding. And so it's necessary that we have all these folks on this call. All of us are connected to a bunch of folks. We need to take all these tools, take all this information. If you're on Facebook Live right now, you can do a watch party and share this video with friends and other folks that you're connected to. And we can really exponentially make a real impact and show the urgency of why this is so important for our democracy. This is about the people. And if we're going to have stimulus money going to the states, it has to really be there to protect the people. And democracy in the leadership of this country on all levels of our government is critically important. And we need to make sure that our voices are a part of that conversation. Next. So we want to know, there's a poll, and I don't know if you want to read it out or you want me to read it out, but we can do the next poll that's come on the screen, and it's: which of the following actions will you take for a safe and secure 2020 election? 1, I'll call my US Senator, again, if I've called before. I'll also write a letter. The next one is I'll write a letter to the editor. I'll reach out to my local election official. And the last one is I'll work on the state level to improve election security. And so for that, I'll turn it back over to Kini to discuss the results. And I hope all of you will do all of these things. That would be great. But really want folks to be able to elevate your voices.
Thank you so much, Diallo. I hope people heed that call to action and commit to doing a bunch of things. It looks like many people are. And I want to apologize on the last poll. Folks were only able to vote for one thing. So lots of people did want to vote for post-election audits, we heard in the chat, but they just couldn't because they had to also vote by mail or chain of custody. So lots of people supporting all the different security measures, giving folks a little bit more time to vote on this last poll about whether they're going to call their US senators, they're going to write a letter to the editor, they're going to work with their local election official or at the state level. And just something to say about local election officials, and I think it'd be great, Audrey, if you can address this too. They are very busy and under-resourced, and so you want to approach them with kindness. Even if they haven't done everything the way that you want, they are very overwhelmed right now. And so imagine if someone came to you at your job and said, hopefully you're able to work if you need to be working, you know, I don't like the way you're doing your job is the first thing they say, then it doesn't tend to work out very well. So imagine yourself in their shoes, but try to do what you can to support them and help move them towards the best practices that we're talking about here. So I'm going to publish this poll. Thanks to everyone on Zoom who voted. Looks like 52% of the folks who voted are going to call their US senators. Thank you so much for that. 38 people are going to write letters to the editor. That's a lot of letters if we can get those published. 51 folks are reaching out to their local election officials. Thank you. That is a big deal. There's a lot of election officials out there and we need your help to reach them. And 67 of you are going to work at the state level. And I bet there's more who are in the live stream who couldn't vote, but we hope that you will take this commitment very seriously and do that outreach. Thank you so much. So now we are going to move into Q&A with all of our speakers. So we're going to get everybody unmuted. We have a lot of questions. There's no way we can go to all of them, but we're going to spend some time on as many as we can. So I'm just going to throw some out there and whoever wants to take it should do that. So the first one is just a broad, we're trying to get $4 billion in the next stimulus. How do we expect to get it passed? What's our strategy to win this $4 billion? Does anyone want to weigh in on that?
And I'll jump in first, and then others can definitely jump in as well. I think the way we win is exactly with what we were talking about, is making the phone calls, putting the pressure on our senators to do the right thing and provide the funding necessary. And I think the more we make it a larger public dialogue and a public want and need, the more pressure that they will have to do the right thing, to make sure that there's money in that package, the right amount of money in that package, to make sure that we're able to have safe and secure elections. And it really is about our voice. If we're quiet, if we're on the sidelines and we don't participate, we don't make our voices heard, we don't ask our friends and our family members to make their voices heard and join in with us, and we don't reach out to our elected officials on the state and local level, then we won't win this. But if we do that, we will put a tremendous amount of pressure on those folks to really do the right thing and make sure that our elections work the right way. We can't be silent at this time.
Others want to weigh in on that?
I just wanted to add that there are a lot of groups that are working on the funding issues, and there's specific focus on engaging Republican senators in key states. There's also been some polling that shows the public opinion supports expanding options for mail-in balloting, and those are very persuasive. And so I think something happened today in Kentucky where the Democratic governor and the Republican legislature reached an agreement to expand mail-in balloting. I don't have all the details because it was breaking news, really. So I think that the effort is going to focus on making this a bipartisan issue, and because everybody votes, it's not as if, one party gets to vote in a safe, secure way and the other party doesn't. I mean, we're all in this together, and I think that there's a lot of effort to engage the Republican side of the aisle on this issue.
I like to agree with that. And we like to point out that we have states with really, really high amounts of vote at home or mail ballots. So like, for instance, Utah, which is traditionally a very Republican or red state, is a full vote by mail state. And we claim them as a vote at home state. They're great. Also, Arizona and Montana are both above 70% usage of absentee ballots. So this is certainly not a partisan issue. And 25% of voters across the country already vote by mail. So you name it, throw a rock, you're going to hit somebody that votes by mail.
And I think one piece, I'm really heartened by the polling showing that you all are willing to talk to your local election officials. Every U.S. senator relies on those local election officials to run their election to get reelected. So they listen to those folks in a very different way. They tend to be less partisan. And so if you can get your local election official, if they're feeling like they need more resources, and you can ask them very politely to let their senators know that those resources are really needed and why and how, those voices are going to be heard in a different way, in addition to our voices, which should put a lot of pressure and a lot of noise on them till they pass this. That's a related question to that. Can you talk more about how to do outreach to election officials? And that's from Ion.
Sure, you can honestly just call them. Most of the time they're super responsive. These are public servants, and they love their jobs, and they love talking to the people that they serve. And that's the experience that I have almost every time that I talk to them. But generally they're very smart people, and they're also very well connected. And so passing information from them to your friends about like how things work, that's important. And also telling your elections official something that could be useful for you, maybe helping them pick where a ballot drop-off box might go, saying, maybe not this place, but this place is closer to a transit line. That's gonna be better for me and my family. That kind of information and that flow is really important. And it's usually a two-way street, and they're just wonderful people.
I agree. You could just call them up. I know my local election officials are working remotely now. The offices are closed, but they're still getting phone calls, and they're still answering emails. And someone in the chat said, be kind to your election officials. Appreciate that. And just they're always, if you approach them with genuine interest and curiosity, they're usually extremely helpful. I think it's really important to get information out. People really don't, I think generally don't understand how elections work and the process and the canvas and that's all open to the public. I encourage you to go if we are able to this year, maybe not this year, but maybe after a vaccine, to go and watch the canvas process. It's open to the public. So, but yeah, I just call them up.
Right. Yeah, and also just ask right now, ask like, is this a good time? Because some of them are completely crazy trying to get ballots ordered and machines ordered for mail. Like, so just ask them when is good. If you, sometimes it's just wait a week. So someone asked, voting by mail sounds like a good antidote to some voter suppression efforts. This is Susan S. From New Jersey, and I worry that it could be corrupted by bad actors. For example, people going undercover in disadvantaged neighborhoods offering help in filling out the mail-in ballot. Have the experts consider the range of possibilities, and what are the protections against that?
I can speak to that one. So first of all, if you're working inside of a system that we recommend with best practices and those sorts of things, safeguards, we recommend things like a standard ballot design with a really accessible set of instructions to it, with information as to where you can find more information online. Those sorts of things will keep sort of voter confusion from ever happening in the first place. Then after that, if you have things like prepaid postage, you're less likely to have someone come to your house and be like, hey, can I deliver your ballot for you? That's where some shady businesses happened in places like North Carolina, where they don't have the sort of safeguards that we recommend. And then, just being able to drop it in the mail is a really good way to ensure that there's no funny business. Otherwise, just creating a really good process for your voters to get information is really sort of the very first step towards that kind of security. And I'm not sure if I'm just reading my computer funny, but I think I see a sparkle in Marian's eyes there. I think she's got some ideas too.
Well, I was going to say, elections have risks. There are risks in every aspect of our elections. These are risks, not certainties. Just because the risk is out there doesn't mean that it will actualize, number one. But also, you can mitigate the risk by having, I think as Audrey mentioned, multiple options for ballot return and reasonable restrictions on the delivery and return of ballots to prevent ballot harvesting, but not to completely block out legitimate people who can collect ballots and deliver them. Also, illegal coercion and vote buying are illegal everywhere. And under most state election codes, if you are caught, you lose the right to vote. That is the punishment for violating the election code in that way and interfering with voting. Finally, we talk a lot about retail and wholesale fraud. The size of the conspiracy necessary to make that tactic have an impact on the outcome is so large that would break down and would be detected. And the detectability of fraud is a very important concept, especially in the concept of resiliency.
One thing I want to add too, just from an advocacy perspective, I think a lot of organizations, I think it was mentioned at the top, somebody mentioned the 1-866 Our Vote is making sure that folks are reporting any bad acting that's out there. And so there's folks that are able to respond and support communities that are being impacted by this. But also, like, one of the things that we've done with some of our members as they're doing, just preparing folks for voting in the first place, is making sure that the folks are ready. And so I'm making sure that folks are aware about the tactics that tend to be out there, because they're out there, particularly in marginalized communities. And so we're making sure that we're educating folks. We're making sure that folks are aware, making sure that our organizations are prepared to support communities that are under attack, and that we're reporting those instances and having folks out there to do work with them to make sure that we stop it when we see it. And so we need to continue to be in conversation as folks are a part of this. If you see it, let folks know. The more of us that know about this, the more that we can intervene, particularly on the front end, especially if we have a runway into an election process. We can get out in front of that and really protect communities. It's so vitally important. This is a critical election. All elections are critical elections, and we need to make sure that folks are protected and have their voices heard at the ballot box.
Thanks so much. I think there's a related, well, there's a couple of things to say, but I see that we're running close to time, and I want to ask speakers, we have so many questions and a lot of people eager to get them answered. Would you be okay with running 5 or 10 minutes over, Marion?
Sure.
Diallo, everybody's nodding. Okay, thanks so much. And we understand not everybody can stay on. We want to respect your time. Feel free to drop off if you need to, but we're going to stay on until 9:40 Eastern to try to answer more of these questions because we have so many of them. So I'm going to actually field one and open it for others to field. Jennifer says, I live in California, a state which supports people's right to vote. How do I help change things in states with voter suppression tactics? And I think I'll start, but I'd love to hear what other folks think. One, I think it still varies by community how secure and protected people's rights are. And so you want to just be paying attention to the neighboring communities if you do feel like things are pretty good in your county. But also in terms of the congressional funding, every stimulus package is a giant negotiation between the two parties, and both parties have to come to the table absolutely ready to fund elections. And there is not a single Democrat or Republican that does not need more pressure to make sure this is a big number for elections. So every single call, if you're calling every other day to your senators, you're calling your rep, all of those calls are really important. It doesn't matter what party they're in. This has to be number one. Otherwise, we might not get it, and we know the consequences of that are disastrous. So the federal work is really important. The state work is important. There will be some more tools coming down the pike. So if you're not signed up with one of our organizations, we will have a follow-up email where you can sign up. You can also find out about that election protection hotline in there. You can tweet at election protection and engage there. But we will have more resources coming from Secure Our Vote and the organizations on this call about how to engage at the state level and support state people in states who are trying to protect their rights. We're just not ready to launch today. Other folks want to address how to be effective from places where you feel like things are good.
It was great.
I think that was great, Akini.
Okay.
The only thing I would say is that, we just need people to continue to call across state lines as well. Like, we all have friends and family members in other places outside of where we live. And so making sure we're calling them and once again, asking them to make those phone calls, to check on how the elections are run in those particular states. And also, like, I think one thing we missed, I think is really important about the election officials is also asking questions about how the process is actually going to work. And so the more information you have, you can identify problems. If there needs to be a early vote polling place and it's not accessible to folks, making sure that you're having conversations on the front end so you know what's actually happening and you can help share information with folks to make sure that elections work. But we have to call outside of our where we live to make sure that this actually works.
Great. A number of people are asking if they can have access to the slides after the presentation. This will be available as a video on Secure Our Vote and all the cross-posting organizations that you may be watching on Facebook. I'm happy to make our Secure Our Vote slides available with the asks, but I'll leave it to the other speakers what they would like to do. That. Okay. So we'll send you some resources after the fact. If there's specific things you're looking for, let us know. And that info@secureourvote.us is a good place. We can try to triage and make sure it gets to the right person. So many questions. Please clarify the difference between vote at home and absentee ballots.
Oh, sure. I was talking so fast there, so my apologies if I was not clear. 8 minutes is very short. So absentee ballots are available in every state. You can apply for them. Some states make you sort of meet some qualifications for that. And that's important to note. When we talk about vote at home, we're talking more about the systems and processes around really the whole voting process, but in particular, these mail and absentee ballots. It's not quite enough to just mail someone a ballot. If they don't have good instructions, if the system is not secure, you know, if it's not matching up with other parts of the system, it's not going to be as effective. So when we say vote at home systems, those are sort of the comprehensive ideas around how to make a larger ecosystem work for everyone.
Great. It seems, this is a question from Eric. It seems that most of the ballots that become spoiled, lost, not counted, or a disproportionate number come from African American, Latinx, and low income areas in some of the big cities where we often see voting issues. And in swing states, what can we do to address that?
So I think that both Audrey and I talked about that. I think one thing, there are practices for the ballot tracking, either using the intelligent mail barcode system from the United States Postal Service, or Ballot Tracks is an example of a vendor that has an end-to-end system for tracking ballots from beginning to end. That allows voters to, you know, if they've requested a ballot and they haven't gotten it, they'll be advised of where they are in the process. I do think, I guess I also want to stress that we need a multi-layered approach here to this risk of the public health crisis. Mail-in voting will work for a large number of voters. It's not going to work for everyone, so we need other options. And those options include expanding early voting if the state already has early voting. We're trying to avoid congregating large numbers of people in a single location. So spreading out early voting on locations, and also having some in-person voting on election day plus mail-in voting will, I think, spread the voters out. And so I think what Colorado's experience has been, they are an all-mail voting state, but they have so many options for their voters. That's why their turnout is higher, because of all the options that are given voters in that state. And we need to do that everywhere on an emergency basis this year.
I absolutely agree. I'm from the great state of Colorado. I'm here in Denver. I love it. My nearest voting place is actually just like 3 blocks from my house, but it's a centralized location. And so if anything were to happen, my dog ate my ballot, I spilled coffee on my ballot, it never arrived, or you know, any manner of issues, I can walk into that door and they can handle anything. So long as I'm in my own county, those voter service centers are full service. So that includes accessible voting, help with literally anything, even up to same day registration. We think that those pieces are essential, and it's tough in the climate that we're in right now. But that's certainly an equity piece, and also to make sure that the places where services are provided, to have them placed equitably, and to make sure that they're in communities that will access them, and then make it easier to access them. So put it near a transit line, put it near a community space that people trust and feel safe at. Those kinds of best practices, they don't require law changes most of the time. And oftentimes you can move those rules and best practices just by talking to your local officials. So that's why we push that so much.
Yeah, and that's another reason I said, you know, it's important also to build relationships with our elected officials on the state and local level as well, because it make it in their best interest to make sure that their communities are able to participate in the process, and having them elevate their voices as well around why this is important, making sure that there's accessible locations for folks, that there's multiple options like we've mentioned, and that folks are able to participate how it makes sense. And then even as they're doing in-person sites, particularly around early voting, it's really emphasizing making sure that there's social distancing that's happening, that they're safe, that they're you know, that there's the proper protection that's both for the folks that are working in those places, but also for the folks that are coming to cast their ballot. And I think the more that people feel comfortable, the more likely folks are to participate, however it makes sense for them, given the options that they have.
Great. So a lot of folks are worrying about the post office. We didn't have much time to get into that. It's sometimes considered a separate issue, but because there's so much concern about its finances, how might that impact voting in 2020?
I think it's a fair question. I do think it's a fight. This is going to be my personal opinion. Vote at Home doesn't necessarily take a stake in this, but personally, I think that there will be a compromise that comes out of one of the next stimulus packages. The post office is constitutionally mandated to exist, so there's certain pieces that you can't just make it go away. You can't just bankrupt it. That said, there's going to be some very serious negotiation around it, and I have every hope that it will be okay. And I did see another question, if you don't mind me sort of grabbing onto it while we're talking about the post office. I saw one about, how do we deal with any glitches that have to do with mail ballots in the post office? And I just want to sort of re-up what some of Marion had been talking about intelligent barcodes. The post office is very, very good. And they use tracking similar to like what Amazon does. And they can help you track your ballot. So that's a thing that you can advocate for at your local or state level. It's a fairly cheap, thing for an office to implement. And it brings a lot of service and confidence to the voting process for the voter, let alone the ability for an office to understand if the ballot never arrived at someone's house. So two different things there, but I wanted to make sure we got to them.
Yeah, I think that the Postal Service provides services on such a wide variety of things. I think it's really separate from elections, but it is critical to pivoting to mail-in voting. And I think that there's many communities in America that will be devastated if the Postal Service went out of business. That they're the only game in town in many, many communities. And I just want to point out for all of those candidates out there, the Postal Service delivers a lot of campaign literature, and so not just ballots. So, and I don't know about you guys, I'm getting an awful lot of campaign messages right now from the Postal Service. So, I hope that cooler heads will prevail and they will work together to support the Postal Service because of it's a much broader impact than just this one issue about mail-in voting. But if something were to happen, there's other alternatives. We already talked about some of them, which are Dropbox, even on election day, dropping off ballots at a polling location or a vote center. I think that would be doable to drive, just like the contactless service that we are all experiencing now and many other services. That would be something. But we keep going back to this resource need. All of these issues, we're gonna need resources, and the biggest resource is going to be staffing. I know there's a lot of talk about, well, we need this equipment, that equipment, but we really need our bodies. We need people who are going to be able to handle the increase in the volume of these alternative voting methods. And so that's where the funding, I think, where the funding needs, and they really have to be pushed out to the local level because they're the ones that are running elections. It's the local jurisdictions that run our elections.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and the people piece is so important to this, actually functioning the right way, and also making sure that those people that are doing that work, they become frontline workers, and making sure that they have the protections they need to be safe in this current environment that we're in too. So, like when you talk about the funding has to drive to all the places that make this work the right way for everyone.
Thank you. So we're right at time. We told people we give them an extra 10 minutes. We're at 9:40 Eastern now. So we're going to wrap. I'm just going to repeat what our asks are. You will get a follow-up email if you registered on Zoom, and we will post the asks also on Facebook in the comments under the live stream. We want $4 billion appropriated from Congress in the next stimulus package, not waiting for another single one. We do not have a moment to wait. Elections are expensive and they need to start ordering these things now. We want you to call your senators. There's going to be that number in the follow-up email. I want you to write letters to the editor, and we are going to follow up with you with other asks. So please sign up. The follow-up email will have links to our organizations so you can find out more about the work and get some of your other questions answered there. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for
And we'll
having
be
us.
having another conversation soon. Hope to see you all then.
That's great.
Thank you, and applause to Katie for a great job moderating.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great
Katie.
job.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for everybody for tuning in too. This is great.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
all the
you.
participants. Bye all.
Bye.
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 Stay safe, everyone.